So let me introduce you to Martine Dowden. She's going to give this talk today about typesetting in CSS and how to use typography to enhance your design. So Martine is an award-winning CTO, user experience and UI designer, as well as developer, internal speaker, and author on top of all that. She focuses on web interface that are beautiful, functional, accessible, as well as usable. She approaches user experience from both the artistic and science side, drawing from her degrees in psychology as well as visual communication. She has worked as a developer, artist, educator, and consultant since 2005. And with that said, I'm going to give it to Martine to start their talk.
Okay. Feel free to ask questions during the presentation. I will try to keep half an eye on the chat. So let's get started. So I wrote this talk because as I started my journey in traditional media, and I was doing a lot of, painting, doing inks, watercolors, those sorts of things. And so there's a lot of typography involved in some of those things. And then I moved over into the digital space and I started creating websites and realized that typography, especially in CSS, was a completely different beast than it had been when I was doing the more traditional medias, right? We have different knobs and different ways we can access it. And there's some things that are easier on the web and some things that are definitely harder. And so I put this talk together to kind of look at when we're thinking typography, what are some things that we can do in order to make our designs kind of enhance those designs? Because if we think about it, our websites are full of type, right? Whether it's a form, whether it's something explaining something, we're full of text. So what are some things we can do to use that as a piece of art for our pieces, for our websites, for our applications? Let's go back a little bit back into history and let's look at why it's even important. Since the very dawn of time, right, typography was something that even if we didn't think about it in those terms, communication was something that we wanted to do from a very, very early stage in history and as humanity, from the hieroglyphs all the way to the printing press later on, and then the web. But as we changed our media, right, we went from stone and clay tablets all the way to the digital era, we gained some things and we lost some things. And now with CSS and with the web, we have a very different way of treating our typography than we did when we were using, chisels and stone tablets. So let's look at the definition of typography. What does that word even mean? Well, it comes from the Greek typos, meaning impression, and the Latin word graphia, to write. And so you put them together and you have typography, which essentially boils down to the art of designing with type. So how can we do this on the web? Well, first, we have the different typefaces that we can use, right? In this particular example, I'm showing a typeface called Montserrat and one called Railway. They're both from Google Fonts. And we can assign those to our projects, and we can have multiples and assign them to different elements, or we can have a single one that we apply everywhere. But there's already a choice to be made when we're choosing which type are we going to use. Because there's many different types of alphabets that we can use. We have serif and sans serif. Those are going to be kind of the two various pieces. And then each of those, even within those categories, and there's several others we're going to talk about here in a second, different pieces of the letters might have different aspects to them, right? And all of those things come together to form our alphabets. Now, I'm keeping this very the traditional like Latin-based letters centric, mostly because I don't know a whole lot about the other alphabets, and I don't want to misspeak or misrepresent them in any way. So I do acknowledge that this is a very Western world-centric talk in a lot of ways, and it is not that I don't understand that there are other alphabets out there or don't want to present them. I just don't know enough about them to feel comfortable presenting them at this point. We have two main types of alphabets. We have serif and sans serif, right? And those are the little tick marks at the end. So Times New Roman, which we might be familiar with, especially if we were in school. How often were we told, you know, write your paper in Times New Roman, double space, et cetera, et cetera. That's the very typical thing in the United States. And then we have the sans serif, which is what we generally see on the web today. The example here I chose was Lato. Then we also have, oh, why is it not? There we go. Then we also have things like display fonts, and there's different subcategories we can go into, but the display fonts are generally going to be the ones that are really fancied up for whatever reason. They're going to be a lot more graphically interesting, or they're going to be a lot more themed. And they're generally not very good for large bodies of text, because with the fact that they're a lot more ornate, they're going to be a little bit more difficult to read. But they're really good for titles or for enhancing a particular piece. Really? There we go. And the last one is monospaced, which I wanted to touch on. If you're a developer like me, you'll often use a monospaced font for things like your code editor, right? And what's very particular about those fonts is that every letter has the exact same width. So if you have an I, for example, which is much more narrower letter than a W, the amount of room that is allotted to it is going to be the exact same regardless of their width. So the spacing gets a little funky at times. However, it means that our letters align beautifully in a code editor, for example. When we pick our invariable fonts, I fully acknowledge, throw a wrinkle in this. But traditionally speaking, when we picked a typeface, we had to kind of look at what versions of said typeface were available to us, because every alphabet had a family of things that we could use. And so depending on if they were created or not, or if they had been designed by the designer or not, because if we think back to the printing press, historically, if you wanted to make your font thicker, or if we wanted to make it italics, we couldn't just programmatically take our piece of wood or a piece of metal and skew it, right? Or make it fatter. It was a different set of type. And so that translated for a very long time in the digital world, where if the designer had not designed a digital version for each of the thicknesses and whether or not italics, they would not exist. Now with variable fonts now, we can do that programmatically to some level. You should still generally see a regular font versus an italics, but that changes things a little bit. But still, there are a slew of fonts out there that are not variable fonts. And so you still have this aspect of, does a particular weight or slant, or does the italics exist? And so when we import them, we want to make sure we're importing whatever font we choose, because there are very, very few fonts that actually are going to be available on everybody's machine, right? Whether you're using a Windows machine, whether Mac versus Linux, the types of fonts and typefaces that are loaded onto that machine by default or have been added by the user are going to be different. And so there's very few what we call website fonts, which means it's a font that's pretty much everybody's going to have. So when we choose a font, say from Google Fonts or whatever, we need to make sure we not only that we declare it, but we also import it. And we can always add fallbacks. So if we don't want to import a font, but we want to say, hey, if you happen to have Barlow on your machine, go ahead and use Barlow. And if you don't, then we'll use Helvetica and so on. So we can also put fallbacks in case that typeface does not exist if we don't want to load it. And so from there, we can define what our weights and what our weights are going to be. Now, the thing is, especially with those traditional fonts, we need to make sure that we've imported the different weights that we want. In this example, I've gone ahead and imported just the standard Barlow font, and then I've said, hey, I want a font weight of 800 on the header, and I want a font on the first header and a font weight of 300 on the bottom header. However, we can see that 800 is really, really thick, and that really doesn't look that thick. And my H2 is kind of looking a little wonky as well. And so the reason that happened is because we need to make sure we're importing all of those variations. So that's where we need to make sure we're getting every piece we're going to use. We need to go ahead and import. We can also use, so the numbers, 400 is generally kind of your normal font. 700 is bold. And your number values go from 100 to 900, or we can use keywords, which is what I think we see the most often, at least what I've run into the most often. And then we look at italics, which italics is and I present it with oblique because it has its own sets of, they kind of work together, but not. So italics is generally going to be a different set of type, right? And sometimes the letters will even be different. So in this example, I've taken the same font family, and on one aspect, I've given it the font style of italic. On the other side, I've given it the font style of oblique. And if we look at the letter F specifically, we can see that they're not actually the same font. What happens is with italics, it's a different set of type. With oblique, we take the standard font and we skew it. And so I present them together because if you have italics loaded, oblique will default to italics. And then if you don't have italics loaded, an italic font loaded, or the machine can't find an italic version, it'll go ahead and apply an oblique. And so that's where they kind of work together. So if the other thing with oblique is we can actually determine the degree of the skew, which we can't do with italics, right? Italics, think back, metal font, you can't do anything to it. Oblique is programmatic. We're taking the standard font and we're skewing it. Now, again, this won't work if you have an italics version loaded, because what happens is if the computer or the machine knows that italics exist, it'll go ahead and has an italics version of the font. It's going to go ahead and load that. But if you don't, and you're applying an oblique, then you can go ahead and give it a degree of skew, which is kind of cool. And it's also very quickly become unreadable, but as demonstrated by the last one on the list. But those are some fun things, fun ways that you can kind of tweak how the font can look. The other thing we can do to our font is add a drop shadow. So the same way we might add a drop shadow to a div, right? To give it some dimension, we can do that to our text, but instead of drop shadow, it's called text shadow. It has the exact same syntax with the X offset, Y offset, blur, and our color. So that is the exact same. But again, those kind of things, be very ginger with them, because it can very quickly become unreadable depending on the color, the amount, and large body of text versus not. So we have large body of text. What are we going to do with it? So here we have, I've taken the text I'm using right here is this from Beowulf. And we have our characters that are we have all of our lines, right? And they're kind of put together, but they're kind of squished together. So let's look at some leading. So the term leading comes from, again, the old metal printing presses, where in order to make our lines more spaced, we would add bars of lead in between our letters, and so hence the word leading. Well, and we've kind of lost that terminology in CSS, and we now use line height as our property, and we're going to determine how much space, how high our line is going to be, and we can give that a number and a value. So we can give it a value that has a unit. So in this case, I've given my paragraph, one of the paragraphs, a line height of 1.75 ems. And then the span inside of it, a font size of 3 ems. So what happened with that is because I gave a value that has a unit to the line height, it's going to very specifically apply that line height. But then in my span, when I increase the font size, we can see that we have overlap, right? The rest of our paragraph looks fine. We have that 1.5 line difference between them, but that piece that got where the text became bigger, they overlap. So the way we prevent that is we don't give a unit to the line height. We essentially acts like a multiplier. So if I give things a line height of 1.75, which is we want 1 line and 3/4 space, right? What happens is once I increase the font size, it's going to say, oh, you want 1 3/4 space? Great. I got 3 rems. Great. We're going to do 1 3/4 of 3 rem. So if we don't apply a unit, it's going to automatically scale correctly with the font size. If we do apply a unit, it's going to take that absolute value, and you may end up with some overlap. So depending on the effect you're going for, that could be valuable. However, for the most part, as the general rule, I end up using it without a unit. That way it automatically scales and I don't have to think about it. The other thing we can do when we're kind of figuring out our text is drop caps. So if you think of the old manuscripts, that initial letter at the very beginning of text, a piece of text was called a drop cap, and it was usually illuminated. It was very beautiful. That's one of those things that we can do in CSS. It takes a little bit more work though. So what we can do is we can use the we can use first letter, which allows us to go ahead and target the first letter of any kind of element, whether it's a paragraph, a div, whatever. Pick your poison. And so at that point, we can assign very special characteristics to that first letter. So over here, I've taken the first letter of our paragraph, and I've said I wanted to change the color and then change the particular font so I could pick something more ornate. And then I went ahead and I floated it, because now that I've made it bigger, it was kind of hovering on top, and then adjusted its positioning. And so by doing that, we can go ahead and regain kind of that sense of illumination if we want, without having to break up a word. I didn't have to change my HTML in any way. I could just target it using first letter. Thing with first letter is, though, is that's it. Unlike for other elements, we can use first child or nth of type, or we have nth of, nth child or nth of type. We don't have that for letters. The only one available to us is first letter. We can also do first line in the same way. So again, those, it's just first line. You don't have an nth of line or a last line or anything like that. You just have first line. But that way we can also style our first line, and that will wrap correctly with responsive web, which is super cool, because we can, like, if I were to shrink the screen or increase the width of the screen, it's still going to apply to the first line and understands the concept of it's a line, not necessarily a block of text. So again, we can conditionally style that first line without having to add spans and having to worry about responsiveness and all that fun stuff, because it'll just work, which is really nice. The next thing we're going to look at is we have links inside of our text. In this particular example, I've gone ahead and taken all of the names and I've linked them and made them into links, so that potentially, if we take a real world scenario, maybe that links to some kind of appendix that shows you who's what and reminds you who's who, right? So let's go ahead and style those. One of the quintessential things about links is that they come by default underlined on the web, right? And we can actually style and do things about that underline. So text decoration actually takes multiple properties. The general text decoration is a shorthand. We have text decoration line, which determines where it goes. Text decoration color is if we wanted to change the color of the underline without changing the color of the text. We have the text decoration thickness, so that works kind of like a border thickness, right? We can change how thick the line is. And then text decoration is the kind of the shorthand where we can stick everything together, the position, what type of line it is, the color, and the thickness. So let's look at some example with specifically the positioning. So the thing that's interesting is you can actually put multiple of the positionings on them. So you can totally do an overline, underline, and strike through all at the same time. It's an interesting concept. You can do it. I'm not sure when the application would be, but it is perfectly possible to do, which I thought was pretty cool. The other thing you can do is change what kind of line it is. So same as for border, we can do solid, double, or dotted, or dashed. And we also have wavy. So when you see that spell check wavy thing, yeah, that's actually how it's done. It's a text underline, except they've changed the nature of the line to being wavy. We can also determine the position. Now, your mileage may vary on position. The support is still a little funky, but you can actually change whether it is auto or under, for example. But yeah, the support on that is still trickling in via throughout the different browsers. So your mileage may vary on that one. So I'm changing over to a different piece of text here. I'm changing over to Peter Pan. We had been dealing with Beowulf, which is a poem and has very set line length. And here I'm changing over to Peter Pan, which is just a story. And the line lengths are no longer controlled by returns like they were in a poem. And so if we extend our screen really, really wide, what we see is our line lengths becomes really, really, really wide. And so that becomes very problematic to read, because once you get a particularly large line length, what happens is our eyes don't track it very well. We don't know where to return. And then readability and then the ability to retain the information suffers and speed suffers. So what do we do? One of the things we can do is look at the size of our alphabet. And based on the letters, so we have this unit called CH. And what CH does is it looks at the width of the 0 character, the glyph that is the number 0. And that's what it determines as the unit of length or the unit of measure. And then what we can do is when we look at, if we type out our alphabet A through Z, and we take that 1.5 times to 2 times, that's what's more or less an ideal line length is what they found out. It was studied on print. I haven't found so this is definitely applies to print. I've not found any research contradicting or supporting it for web, but I found in my designs that it actually worked pretty well as a rule still, even on the web. Sometimes I extended a little bit more than the 2, but that's one of the kind of the judges of if you're a lot significantly larger than that, you're going to start having readability problems. And so what we can do is we can take that CH measure and add a max width. So in this example, I've taken that 2 alphabet piece and done a max width of 54 CH. And so it's going to base it on the size of my alphabet, which allows me to very nicely scale the width of my page or of the content on my page. There's a slew of units, by the way. I mean, where most of us are familiar with like M's, sometimes Rems, but there's so many out there. Do check them out because a lot of them are very interesting. The rule of thumb is 54. Yes. So generally speaking, right about 54 is a pretty decent number. And so right here, I have 54 applied. Over here, you can see the difference between kind of the min and the max of 39 to 54 to kind of see the difference. But 54 works really nicely, I find. Again, I haven't seen any evidence so far supporting or denying the translation from print to web. There are some things that don't translate well from print to web, but this one I haven't seen anything for or against yet. I'm sure somebody will do that research at some point. So from there, we can go ahead and take our sections. We have a lot of extra white space, right? So let's see, we can maybe do columns, right? We can think a newspaper or traditional book. Sometimes we have columns. Well, we can do columns. So with columns, we can do, this isn't grid. This is column. We set a column width and the column gap, and that's it. Notice there's nothing on the display property. And by doing this, it'll actually auto-generate the columns based on the content that is here. The problem is that what happens is we have to read all the way down and scroll and continue or all the way down the first color and then scroll back to the top and read all the way down the second column. Not ideal. So we can fix this by going ahead and making it, capping the height so that we don't have to do that. But then we end up with a left and right scroll, which is kind of problematic as well. We don't like left to right scroll on the web. So why am I even presenting this option? It's because, well, in print, it works great. So if we're making a print style sheet for being able to have our content neatly presented in print, it actually understands the concept of the page and will correctly go back on the same sheet of paper to the top and then continue and do our columns the way we would traditionally think of them as books. So as much as it's not as applicable for on the web itself, unless you're doing like a really short list or something, it will work beautifully if you need to have a beautiful print version of whatever web page or website you're creating. The next thing we can do is when we have our paragraphs nicely and neatly nicely put together, our page is starting to look at something. One of the things we can do is we can indent our first paragraph. So I'm not going to, in this particular use case, I skipped our first paragraph because our first paragraph, we did the fancy drop cap in the first line. It's fancied up and leave that one alone. And then I went and so that's hence the not first of type. And then every other paragraph after that, we can do a text indent. Now, text indent is experimental or still labeled as such, but it seems to work in most browsers. And just like most thing, it takes a unit value. So you can take M's, pixels, rems, you pick your poison. But the keyword values are the experimental bits. So if you wanted to do each line or hanging or whatever, or any of those keyword values, those are experimental. So mileage may vary, but the actual value aspect works great. So doing like text indent 2 rem works great. The other thing we can do is judge how our lines end up lining up. So we can look at how we're going to do that. Right now, I have them left justified, so they're kind of squiggled on the side. But we have a couple options we can do. We can center, right? We're all familiar with center for the most part. We can right justify, which is probably the, or left justify, I mean the first one, which is probably the most common that we see. We can justify, which means both ends end up being, you know, straight up and down. There's no ragged edges on either side. Or we can right justify, which because we write from left to right can be quite difficult to read because we don't ever know where we're coming back to that left side. So for designing typey things that are like a short, maybe a title or something, that works pretty well, but for long bodies of text, not so much. So let's look at what justify, though, as cool as it looks, and it looks rather clean, has a couple of pitfalls that we want to make sure of. When we justify our content, we're extending this amount of space between our words in order to make them fit beautifully on either edge. The problem with that is depending on the font, depending on your width, depending on your content, there's a lot of depends. What you may end up with is these awkward white space, which I've highlighted in blue over here, that end up making these kind of white lines throughout your text that can be a little bit visually distracting. These are called rivers. And so we need to be careful, and badly kerned fonts can also have this problem. So we need to be careful that that doesn't come into play. So as much as justification is very pretty and makes for a very tight, very clean, you know, a design with clean lines, it can have some impact on readability, especially depending on the font and the width of your content. So I just mentioned kerning. So what is kerning? It's the letter spacing in between the letters. So when it's something that we can do in order to handle to increase or decrease the amount of space between our letters. And so that's something that's usually done for effect in order to make something look a lot tighter or cleaner. Because when types are designed, right, we can't account for every last variation between letters, right? We may have, we have eyes, we can account for the spacing of a letter, and that will work in most cases. We're still going to have some awkwardness. So especially for titles or things like that, we may want to kern it. Now, just like many things, we had mentioned that first letter only works on first, you know, on first letter. We can't just say, hey, I want the fifth letter in this word to go ahead and kern it or do something with it. We can do it across the entire string, or we have to add spans and do it that way. So kerning can create some problems for readability. So it's something you want to use for like short bits, and like, especially in this example where I've really stretched the letters, right? We want to do that sparingly, and we don't want to do that for large bodies of text, but it can make for a really cool effect. Or if we're using a font that was created that was maybe not kerned the way we like it, and we want to kind of narrow the gaps between them overall, we can do that, but be ginger about it because it may affect your readability. Font variants, those are things that we can use to change how our glyphs are being treated. So one of the things we can do is whether or not we decide to have ligatures. So a font may or may not have ligature to begin with. So like whether or not that glyph was created by the designer may or may not exist. So if it doesn't exist, it's a moot point. You're not going to have them. But if it does exist, we may choose to go ahead and display them or not. Ligatures are when we take two letters to form a new glyph. So some of the common places you might see it are FI, FL, FF, FFI, and FFL, where we can see that they've combined two pieces in order to create that letter. And they were usually in the old days of the printing press, and with the metal types or the wooden types, they were a different glyph entirely. The ampersand kind of comes from that concept of merging letters into a different glyph. So this is, I think this is Braille-way, if I remember correctly. I'd have to double check. But some fonts have them, some fonts don't, and we can determine programmatically in the CSS if we want to use them. The other thing we can do is determine how we want our numbers to be treated. Some fonts have a what's called old style figures, where the letters bleed above and below each of the letter spaces, and we have modern figures, which is the numbers are all lined up on the line, and we can determine whether our numbers are going to be treated as modern or as old style figures as we choose. So, for example, in this table of contents, I've gone ahead and changed them to go ahead and use to align my numbers and to make sure that they were all in the same line instead of bleeding up and down. And of course, we can't really talk about font variant without talking about small caps, which basically takes your capital letters and makes all of our letters capital letters, except the capitals are bigger than the lower cases, and banks on the height in order to do that. The and text transform allows us to go ahead and change, and small caps changes everything to capital letters. We also have the option to say capitalize uppercase, lowercase, or full width and full width kana. Full width and full width kana are related to they're not something we generally use with Latin languages, but capitalize uppercase and lowercase is yes. They are exactly what they sound. The thing is they don't understand context. So if I say capitalize all the letters and all of the words in the sentence, that's going to capitalize all of the first letters to all of the words, regardless of what that word is. So if we think of standard language where we might have some words we don't capitalize in a title, it wouldn't know about that. It's just going to capitalize everything. So worth knowing, but really convenient if we want to make sure we keep consistency in our titles, for example. The last thing we can go ahead and one of the things we can go ahead and treat with text is images. Now, flow, especially in CSS, can have a little bit of a better reputation, but what it is really, really, really good at, and it is still the best use of flow, one of the best things to use flow for is handling images within our text, because it makes our text flow nicely against the image. And recently, the CSS has added ways that we can actually form those images and have the text follow those images, which is really super cool, although that's an entirely different talk for a different day because we don't have enough time to actually cover the details of that. But it is very much possible, and I highly encourage you to look into it. And so with that, I want to leave you with all of the code I've presented is available on GitHub. And you have our repo right here. And feel free to follow me on social media. Twitter is the best bet to come and find me. So feel free to ask questions. My DMs are always open.
Thank you, Martine, for your talk. That was very, very interesting and a very good introduction as well to typography. So we're going to take a question. We have 10 minutes for them. So
sure.
Feel free to type them in the chat.
Thank you all for coming.
So while we wait for question, I do have one actually for you. Coming from print, what was the difference between typography for print versus web? You touched a bit about it, but I wanted to know a bit more. For example, I was taught that you should not use more than 3 different fonts when you do like anything in print. That apply to web as well?
Yes. So I think the biggest change is in print. We have your paper size never changes, right? There's no, you lay it out and it doesn't move. With web, that's not true. Because different devices, different screen sizes, different, resolutions, things are always moving. So I think the biggest change for me, whether it's in typography, is affected, right? Because where things like preventing things like, widows and those sorts of things is a lot more difficult in web because everything moves. You can't just say, oh, when we're exactly this with, we can use media queries to temper some of that. But I think that was the biggest challenge. Is getting used to the concept of things moving. And then in terms of what was the second half? There was 2 halves to your question.
More like and I think that kind of touched to Anna Marie question. She wanted advice for pairing fonts.
Oh, yes, the
question
3.
Was,
yeah, 3. Yeah. So 3 and on the web, I was actually taught 2, one for your headers, one for your body. But more and more, what we're seeing is people just sticking to 1. And is it a design trend? I don't know. The thing is, for every typeface that you grab, right, or that you import, unless you're using one of the web-safe ones, you're having to load it. So the more fonts you have, or the more typefaces you choose, the more things you're having to load into your page. And so there's performance considerations more that you may want to keep in mind. So you're balancing your design with your performance considerations at that point, right? So I end up using most of the time one. If I'm going to use two, I'll generally do one for my headers or something kind of, and I'm generally at that point picking something fairly display-like. And then I'll pick one for my bodies of text. If you're not sure how to pair, make sure that they're quite different, right? You don't ever want to get into a situation where you have two fonts that are so similar that people think you accidentally made a mistake and used the wrong one at a particular point in your design. So historically, for beginners, what I tell them is pick a serif and a sans serif. That way there's no, and be consistent in your usage, because that way there's no ambiguity. It's like, it's very deliberate. Or pick a display and then a sans serif, right? For pairing, the other thing you can do is that if you're using Google Fonts for picking your fonts, at the bottom, they'll give you suggestions on what works well, or fonts that have been often paired with that font. And generally their suggestions are pretty good. They work pretty well together. So those are other ways that you can kind of get, but I mean, at that point, you're getting to the subjective of, you know, do I find this appealing, visually appealing, right? There's no, it's kind of it's a preference thing, and it's a style thing based on what your theme is, what you're going for in terms of your design.
Right, thank you. So we have a question from Madison next. Who asks, do you have a recommendation resource for learning more about CSS and other front-end languages?
So CSS in general, I do have, I mean, I kind of have to promote it. I do have my book, Architecting CSS, which is, you know, selfish self-promotion, which is all about architecting it. In terms of CSS and typography specifically, I don't know of any off the top of my head. In terms of learning about different types and their histories, there's a book called Just My Type, which I thought was hilarious and very nicely written, that it kind of gives, as much as it's not going to give you much for practical advice, it's a really nice history of how certain fonts came about and why. And I find that that has helped me as a designer. If I understand the history behind a particular typeface, it really helps. Like, I don't know, I find it easier to decide if I should use it or not. And you know, so because it kind of gives you how has this been used in the past, because if it was created for a specific purpose, you know, that's what, you know, that's how it was or why it was used in the past. And it's a book that the author is, it was just a nice read. So that one would be kind of nice. Most of my typography stuff I found by bits and pieces of lots and lots of Google search, a nugget here, a nugget here, that I've, you know, kind of drug into one place over time.
So the next question is from Mackenzie, who asked, who was looking at the CSS shapes and was wondering what kind of sets that apart from using custom border radius for image. Sorry, I'm just trying to see what kind of features set it apart.
The shapes, you can make it do any bloody shape you want. Because what happens with CSS shapes, let me go back to that. This is actually not being done by border radius. It's been like, I'm using the actual CSS shape ellipse. You can do polygons, you can do ellipses, you can do, you can pull in an entire SVG and have it follow a complex curve. So you can make it do any shape you want, practically. If you can code it as an SVG, you can make it do it, basically. So it's, that is not stuck to border radius. And the big thing with it is by using CSS shape instead of just border radius, we can make it curve. Now we can get the curve to work with border radius as well. That's a different thing, but yeah, you can make it any shape you want it to be, literally.
So the next question is from Rina, who asked, as someone relatively new to CSS, what would you consider the most basic set of CSS skills that they should learn?
The most best CSS skills I would learn. learn and understand the box model, like the margin, padding, border, and how they interact with each other. And there's a property called box sizing, which has a handful of values. Look into that and understand the relationship between your box sizing and your box model. And then layouts and those sorts of things will become infinitely easier. So that to me, I think, is one of the fundamentals. The other one would be understand your cascade and understand things like inheritance and specificity. So, for example, it's a lot harder to override something that's been applied to a class that's an ID-based class versus a element-based class. Understanding those differences in order to understand how things are being applied is going to be very important. So what I would do is I would component-based architecture where you have segregated CSS everywhere makes it very difficult to understand that cascade because nothing gets inherited from somewhere else and it's all segregated. So grab a normal HTML page and style it, and start writing some cells so that you can understand how that relationship of inheritance, overriding, specificity, all of that works, and learn that box model. Those, to me, are probably the two main principles to understand. They're also some of the hardest principles to understand, so don't get discouraged. But if you understand those two things, everything else is just a matter of do you know a particular property and value.
And we have time for one last question from Lisa, who asks if you have any resource for promoting accessibility via CSS.
Okay. So promoting accessibility is hard. I don't have anything specifically to typography or CSS, but the answer is always the same: test, and run your automated tests, run all of that, and make sure it passes. The thing with fonts is your legibility is the most important things when it comes to accessibility. And unlike colors, where you can run a color contrast ratio and it just, it'll tell you pass, you don't pass. There's not really run a text legibility test and it passes, don't pass. Like there's not really that kind of hard set line that we can say, yay or nay. So that's a lot harder with typography. But in terms of promoting accessibility, the importance of it, why it's important, understanding that by when you are accessible, you open yourself up to more markets. With more markets comes more money. Therefore, being accessible brings you more users, brings you more money. It's financially interesting to be accessible. It's the right thing to do. I didn't figure that I don't have to mention that one, but it's the right thing to do. And in some places, legally, you have to. So it's a protection against legalities to be effective, to be accessible. So those are kind of my main points, and I'm trying to convince people that they should be accessible. Obviously, tailor to the person you're talking to, but those are kind of where I would, the starting points for where I would go down, how to convince people that it's important.
Great. Thank you very much, Martine. That was a very, very interesting talk. And thank you for everyone for attending this talk. We're going to be done with that one for now. So I encourage you to go and check out all the other talks that we have today, as well as going to the expo to see our partners. And you can also go to the networking tab if you want to connect with other people.